Let us look at the learning outcomes. After studying this module, you shall be able to know and understand the concept of subjectivity. Identify the possible sources of subjectivity in qualitative research. Learn about ways to deal with them. View the positive aspect of subjectivity favorably. Learn how to use subjectivity constructively. Issues in qualitative research. Qualitative researchers face several problems with their methods of study. It is necessary for the researcher to know whether their methods accurately measure the phenomena that they intend to study and whether the results are replicable. This gradually questions the generalizability of the findings. The fact that participants are being studied might cause them to alter their behavior. Over-identification of the researcher with the participants may lead to a bias and the data analysis may lack objectivity. Reaching out to the participants of interest or the target group for the study might pose a challenge at times. For example, if the person intends to study juvenile behavior, at times the researchers have to maintain some level of deception in order to disguise their actual objectivity of the study, and such betrayal of confidences might violate ethical standards of research. A similar issue that needs to be addressed is the subjectivity of the researcher. He or she knows what is to be filtered out and what is to be further analyzed. Therefore, it is to be decided by the researcher what he or she wants to make out of the data that has been collected by him or her. However, in doing so, the person's internal desires, ideas, thoughts, interests, beliefs, opinions, perspectives, etc. might change the nature of the data or the findings. Looking at subjectivity only through a negative view might lead us to overlook its unique contribution to qualitative research in the form of values and quality. We therefore must approach understanding the concept of subjectivity in a holistic manner.
Defining and understanding the concept of subjectivity. According to Morgan and Dury, subjectivity refers to the ways that research is shaped by the particular perspectives, interests, and biography of the researcher. To quote Keller, subjectivity brings with it the notion of the individual as a sapient, sentient being, conscious of his herself as an individual and able to act as a free agent. In this sense, subjectivity is taken to mean of or relating to a subject and evokes the notions of interpretation, perspective, point of view, ideology, and worldview. When a researcher tries to study the experiences of his subjects, he attempts to make sense of the meanings they construct in relation to their environment and experiences. The interaction between the researcher and the participant is a vital aspect of qualitative research, since this forms an important source of subjectivity. When the researcher tries to involve himself closely with his participants to understand a particular phenomena from their perspective, qualitative researchers, according to Denzin and Lincoln, usually work in the real world of lived experience, often in a natural setting, rather than a laboratory based experimental approach. This is what makes them to try to understand social phenomena and what they mean to people. When a person associates the word subjective with an idea or opinion, it reiterates the fact that the opinion idea is subject to various ways of interpretation and that each one of us can have a different unique stance on it. What makes it subjective is the fact that qualitative research seeks to understand a phenomena in depth. It hopes to explore the assumed dynamic reality but does not say that when is seen is replicable. The way one might perceive subjectivity is highly dependable upon the epistemological and ontological assumptions that one holds. Traditional research in the area of natural sciences, for instance, considers objectivity as an essential aspect of research. Thus, even if humans are perceived as objects of experimentation and their feelings are measured by assignment of numbers, subjectivity is avoided as much as possible. In social sciences, however, doing so might invalidate the fact that the researcher is trying to uncover and understand how the social world's experiences are understood and produced, as said by McKellar. As long as there is a distortion or invalidation of research findings, subjectivity is viewed as bias. However, one must also look into the fact that subjectivity arises from the researcher's deep involvement with the topic of research that offers him/her unique insights into the research. The worry of subjectivity arises when the data has to go through the researcher's mind before it is put on paper. According to Putin, chances of subjectivity are enhanced since the researcher is the sole medium of collection and interpretation of the data. This may make him favor those under study. To quote Rajendra, the human factor is the greatest strength and the fundamental weakness of qualitative inquiry and analysis. Subjectivism pulls us away from the reality. Since every viewpoint is unique, they might not be necessarily true. For example, if one researcher thinks that women enjoy getting raped and the other thinks its opposite holds true, neither viewpoint indicate what women truly feel. Ratner also feels that the advantage of understanding subjectivity is to see whether it facilitates or obstructs objectivity. Once this is known, he says, distorting values can then be replaced by values that enhance objectivity. Thus arises the question that how does one arrive at the truth then? Ratner comes to our rescue here. He believes that there might be some empirical criteria to assess whether a researcher is perceiving person psychology accurately or not, just as there are theories to determine illusions of perceptions of others. Wicks and Whitefield say that qualitative research is underpinned by subjectivist ontology and a subjectivist epistemology, which means individuals create their own subjective realities and there is an interrelated and interdependent relationship between the knower and the known. This brings us to the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. Since the absence of bias is considered objective, the presence of bias connotes subjectivity. For quantitative researchers, it is essential to control variables. However, for qualitative researchers, the matter is not so simple. While some suggest an avoidance of subjectivity completely by restricting the analysis of the text, the others may make use of subjectivity in order to understand the subject of research better. While some try to curb this bias, the others use it in a constructive way. They use reflexivity, which, according to Morgan and Dury, is the process of reflecting on one's own subjectivity and how it might be shaping each aspect of the research. According to Smith, qualitative research is mostly constructionist or hermeneutic. However, a researcher might choose how much of his subjectivity and that of his subjects will be included in the presentation of his findings. The study of subjectivity in qualitative research can therefore provide us with an important insight into how to make use of some aspects to enhance the subject under study while avoiding minimizing the biases that might have a bearing on the data. The demand for objective research can be traced to the emergence of scientific thought. For nearly 2000 years, subjectivity has been believed to distort reality, and it has been emphasized that only the knowledge that is valid is objective. To quote Webb, Campbell, Squires, and Secrest, when the human observer is the recording agent, all the fallibilities of the organism operate to introduce extraneous variables into the data. People are low fidelity instruments. According to Campbell, the way subjectivity would creep into research with human observers are errors of direct observation, improper coding, incorrect judgments, bias, and sometimes intentional data distortion. Self report data is a rich source of subjectivity. Some perspectives given by Gog render an explanation about subjectivity in psychological research. The psychoanalytic perspective aims to understand subjectivity as an embodied experience of social interaction which has conscious as well as unconscious levels. Selling Oleson. Oleson also says that subjectivity is not seen as an individual attribute but as a relational and dynamic aspect of the social interaction. To quote Bereswell, The researcher's irritations and affective entanglements instigate a deeper understanding. They provide a better insight. However, it must be kept in mind what Rehato Rosaldo says. All interpretation is provisional, subjective, and dependent on the position of the respective researcher, while institutional and personal entanglements also play a role. Holloway and Jefferson feel that individual behavior and choices are affected by early childhood experiences, associated desires, and defenses used. According to the phenomenological approach, which holds hermeneutics of faith, consider the human subject as an expert of his/her experiences who can provide a transparent account of the same through interview based accounts. According to the social perspective, the individual is a part of an intricately woven social context which has its political and cultural wings, three of which affect human behavior. There is a connection between the man and his society that influences his thoughts, perceptions, etc., which is reflected through what he speaks. Discursive psychologists see the individual as a creative and proactive being who is flexible enough in modifying himself when interacting with others and notwithstanding wider social constraints. According to the hermeneutics of suspicion, narratives of participants reflect the influence that their desires, ideological regimes, and other such unconscious forces have on them without their awareness. The job of the researcher then is to decode the latent meanings behind these. Subjectivity is therefore constructed and complex, keeping in the mind the social and personal contexts. Subjectivity as a problem in qualitative research. Subjectivity can influence the choice of topic, the formulation of hypothesis, the selection of methodology, and the interpretation of data. The researcher therefore feels a need to reflect on the values and objectivity brought about by this method of research. To quote McKellar, objectivity renders the observer as a passive recipient of external information devoid of agency, and the researcher's subjectivity is said to negate the possibility of objectively knowing a social psychological world. The investigator's values are said to define the world that is studied. One never really sees or talks about the world per se. One only sees and talks about what one values dictate. A world may exist beyond values, but it can never be known as it is, only as values shape our knowledge of it. The problem with subjectivity is that it renders the psychological reality unknowable, the reality here being hidden behind the subjectivity of the researcher. The information gathered from case studies and interviews is subject to misinterpretation and observer's bias. Not only do the external factors such as the funding institution's policies affect the study, but also the internal factors, mostly related to the researcher. Subjectivity on the part of the researcher. As a researcher, a person might observe what he/she wishes to observe. This is a really powerful influence that a researcher can have on his/her subjects of study. She/he might therefore selectively choose data for his/her study that are relevant in line with his perceptions. The person may do it consciously or unconsciously. For example, if a researcher believes that religion has a direct causal effect on mental illness, he/she might selectively attach importance to those factors which prove the same and take up case studies which pertain only to this phenomena. What needs to be answered is the researcher considered an outsider, looking in, or as an insider, looking at the society or culture? This too may be subjected to the epistemological outlook of the person. To quote McKellar again, while qualitative research seeks to understand the subjective experience, it must nonetheless be concerned with interpretive openness through a process by which the researcher attempts to acknowledge his or her performed prejudices, biases, and stereotypes, and in so doing, reveal the lens through which he or she builds an interpretation of the subject. Ultimately, one is left pondering to what degree one can be transparent about one's subjectivity. Often, the observer might fail to understand the perspectives of participants. According to Hemsley and Atkinson, When the observer chooses to be a complete observer, the perspectives have to be interpreted from observations in addition to the knowledge possessed by the researcher. Since there is no way to check the interpretations of the responses of the participants, it creates chances of bias on the researcher's part. Over rapport formation or coming too close to participants can influence the responses of subjects. Rajendran states that potential sources of bias in research when the researcher is concerned, the reactivity of researchers with the providers and the consumers of information. Selection biases include the sampling of time, places, environment, people, issues, questions, and the balance between the novel and the mundane. The affinity of researchers with certain kinds of people, designs, data, theories, concepts, and explanations. The ability of researchers, including their knowledge, skills, methodological strengths, capacity for imagination. The value preferences and commitments of researchers and their knowledge or otherwise of these. The personal qualities of researchers, including, for example, their capacity for concentration and patience, tolerance of boredom and ambiguity, their need for resolution, conclusion, and certainty. The fact that the process of observation itself alters, changes, modifies the behavior of participants is referred to as the researcher's effect or the Heisenberg's effect. According to Biggerstaff, the qualitative researcher accepts that he/she is not neutral. What he/she does instead is stepping into the shoes of the participant, subject, and trying to understand the world from the particular person's perspective. To quote him, the hypotheses that emerge are therefore tested against the data of future experiences, example, people's narratives. The researcher, however, plays a very active role in the generation and analysis of data. From the very beginning of the research, the choice of the topic may be called as a result of the researcher's subjectivity. During the study, the researcher's desires, interests, preoccupations, motives, etc., can have a bearing on the data. We generally tend to overlook such factors. However, this does not solely mean that the influence is always a problem, because we might move a step closer to what exactly we are looking for. Devereux suggests that the scientist tries by all means to defend himself against anxiety by overlooking certain data or meanings, overanalyzing others, forgetting certain major or minor concepts, or giving unclear or vague descriptions of his findings. The problems with subject are referred to as self-deceptions by Salner, which are found to be resulting from the researcher's use of defense mechanisms. Some of them can be denial, which according to Perry is a way through which an individual deals with emotional conflicts or internal or external stressors by refusing to acknowledge some aspect of external reality or of his experience. Repression has been defined by Perry as a way by which an individual deals with emotional conflicts or internal or external stressors by being unable to remember or be cognitively aware of disturbing wishes, feelings, thoughts, or experiences. Perry says reaction formation is dealing with conflicts by substituting behaviors, thoughts, or feelings that are diametrically opposed to the unacceptable thoughts or feelings. The defense mechanism of displacement, which helps a person deal with conflicts by generalizing or redirecting a feeling or thought onto another less threatening object. The use of intellectualization, through which an individual deals with conflicts, thoughts, or feelings by the excessive use of abstract or generalized thinking. Omnipotence, on the other hand, is defined by her as the individual's response to emotional conflict by acting superior to others as if he possessed special abilities. Most importantly, researchers use projection, which is defined by Perry as dealing with conflicts by falsely attributing feelings, impulses, or thoughts to others. An individual often makes use of projection when confronted to an object by whom he feels threatened or to whom he feels some affinity. According to Kahn, projection on the behalf of the research is a risk. Since projection is a very powerful defense mechanism that serves as a major reason for researcher bias, the researcher may not be aware as to when his inner conflicts, desires, urges, perceptions, thoughts, beliefs, ideas, etc., are being projected onto the subject in the sample for study. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. The same might apply to a researcher when he is trying to apply his notions about feminism in a study of psychosocial depression in women, for example. One should, however, note that these notions might just be those ideas he favors, thereby failing to consider the critical viewpoint too, a holistic approach. Similarly, limitations due to researchers' own blind spots and a failure to clearly demarcate the line between subjectivity and delusions are some similar risks. As said by Goldman, self deceptions tend precisely to exaggerate the researcher's impression of control and his self esteem. Drapeau says that these problems would be more important when the researcher is already devoted to a certain understanding or position, when certain meanings rising from the data may make this position uncertain, and when the researcher feels anxious when confronted to these difficulties. Subjectivity in the research mentor student diet. This kind of subjectivity has a major impact not only on the orientation of the project but also on how one might understand the subjects. Methodological differences between the research mentor and his/her student, favoring the former's methods or adopting a favorable view towards them in order to avoid conflict, even if the subject does not believe in the effectiveness of the former's methodology. Subjectivity on the part of the subjects. There can be subjectivity on the part of the subjects too. For example, if a researcher is trying to study whether juveniles had abusive childhoods, the juveniles might emphasize and exaggerate the negative aspects of their childhood to gain sympathy. This might then lead the researcher to justify his study in a way that proves it. To quote Go, the subjectivity of the research participant is often overlooked, even when participants are invited to generate subjective reports. Example, descriptions of significant events or memories. The administration of experimenter designed assorted rating scales, example, pleasantness of event, and test, example, later memory recall, dominates proceedings. Subjectivity in data collection or methodology. According to Rosenthal, two possible sources of errors in data collection can be the errors introduced by the researchers as the observer, the errors brought about by the participants as a result of the researchers' influences. This can happen if the researchers' expectations about the outcomes of the study get conveyed to the participants unintentionally. The responses of the participants might then be biased in the sense that they would answer what the researcher wants. This subjective interaction between the two is a major source of error. According to Malloy, qualitative research requires certain actions and reactions of the human being who is the research instrument. His style of interaction, presentation, providing instructions, etc., might therefore have an impact on the methodology. The qualitative researcher spends a good amount of time collecting data from the site situation concerned. This is where he needs to introspect and be aware of his innate biases, prejudices, stereotypes, and opinions. These factors may not be rigid or permanent. Bogdan and Bicklin suggest that the data that are collected provides a much more detailed rendering of environments than even the most creatively prejudiced mind might have imagined to the study. One must remember that the researcher can effectively deal with these biases then, since he mindfully gathers relevant data and does not merely end his study by writing an essay on what he observes in the desired situation. He follows a proper method. The method of data collection is a good source of subjectivity. Ethnographic research studies, for example, hold that committees consist of people where each one has his/her own subjective experiences. Similarly, a phenomenological approach would look at a person's life world as a product of society, culture, history, and individual subjectivity. Subjectivity in measurement. Unlike quantitative research, qualitative research lacks defined appropriate measures since qualitative research is a result of the human mind. The hypothesis and the measures for hypothesis testing are stated by the human mind itself. In qualitative research, Muckler states that there is no agreed on set of measures for any human performance task and setting. Therefore, the absence of a subjective measure therefore necessitates using subjective notions to come up with an appropriate measurement technique. It is often difficult to find objective measures for subjective, abstract concepts like relationships. Subjectivity in data analysis interpretation. Berger and Berry stated that even standard statistical methods turn out to be based on subjective input. Detailed descriptive summaries contain subjective interpretations, but the choice of choosing this method is also contingent on the researcher. Personal judgments of the researcher can influence data interpretation. Qualitative research, by nature, is affected by the personal characteristics and preoccupations. If the person undertaking the research, this might make the participants feel that their views have been misinterpreted. Personal narration carries an element of one's identity. Misrepresentation of data can cause the loss of identity. To quote him, by constructing identities for their participants, qualitative research risks seriously breaching respect for participants' autonomy and may also lead to negative stereotyping. Data can be misinterpreted when the researcher works in isolation. Presenting the results in an objective analysis before proceeding with subjective analysis and involving a dissent in the research process, they call this dissent the peer briefer. This person is chosen on the basis of his knowledge of the research topic and of methodology. He might help by exploring the possible ways in which a researcher could bias his results. Researchers often call upon a friend or colleague or their spouse to be their peer debriefers. Three things are kept in mind while choosing him/her as the dissent: trust, confidentiality, and expertise. The idea to involve a third party is to check the researcher's subjectivity as it helps him/her explore through free association how subjectively the object of the study is seen by him/her. This might bring before the researcher the delusions and fantasies that might drift him from the real analysis of the data. Friedman devised three steps to arrest experimenters' influence: careful selection of data collectors by checking what influence they may have on participation, recording samples of data collection to see whether data collectors are avoiding bias, a selection of experimental design to evaluate post hoc data collection bias. Thornton held a fourth step, that is, training data collectors. A researcher can control biases only as long as she/he is not immobilized by them. This does not, however, call upon the idea about the researcher having a blank mind, but rather to introspect and understanding how she/he might play an important role in shaping the study. Feminists and critical theorists consider subjectivity as an important aspect since it opens a way through which their views and opinions can be entered into the data. This can be achieved by respondent validation, which has been defined by Richards, the process whereby researchers feedback the analysis to the participants before the findings are published. However, this process may require the researcher to establish too much contact with the participant and may go through the same process of interpretation as the primary data, both of which seem to be problematic. The subjectivity brought about by analysis of data can be minimized by the supervision of a research who is a beginner, by expert researchers who can analyze the data. A less direct approach, according to Richards, would be the researcher's awareness about the theoretical approach to the topic and the ways his personal and professional characteristics can have a bearing on the data. In order to accommodate participants' subjectivity, it is important to involve them by elaborating their responses, by providing them open ended questionnaires, and conducting follow up interviews. Incorporating their verbatim can provide their exact thinking and not that researcher is making it up. In order to deal with subjectivity better, some more ways can be made use of. Triangulation, which refers to the use of several methods for data validation. The fact that several people analyze the same piece of data, there will be minimum chances for one method to prevail. Gathering consensus over the findings after data analysis, inter-rater reliability, closely related to triangulation, also helps check subjectivity. Text-based analysis. This refers to an objective method of presenting the data as it is obtained in its very natural form before having subjected to the researcher's interpretations of it. Introspective work of the researcher is necessary to nip subjectivity in the bud before it can contaminate the data. Peer debriefer can be used to evaluate data by different experts who will try to identify and eliminate a single interpretative method. Standardized instructions to participants can be given to elicit objective and similar responses. Random allocation of participants to experimental designs also helps since randomization itself pioneers the concept of objectivity.
Now, to summarize, subjectivity refers to the several ways by which human thoughts, ideas, beliefs, perceptions, opinions, expectations, etc., can have a bearing on the data collected. Subjectivity may be reflected by the researcher by ways of his expectations, choice of topics, and methods of study, misinterpretations of data, and projection of his or her own defense mechanisms. Methodological differences between the researcher and a student, social desirability of the participants, lack of appropriate methods, and misrepresentation of data, and demand characteristics of the researcher are some possible sources of subjectivity in qualitative research. There are, however, many ways to deal with such biases and use the subjectivity constructively in research so that its uniqueness is maintained. Some of these techniques are triangulation, respondent validation, introspection on the part of the researcher, peer debriefing, randomization, and standardization of instructions.